Rook endgames, an active rook. You might well have heard the phrase that you need to activate your rook when talking about a chess game that you've just been playing. Black needs to activate their rook. You might have heard something along those lines. What does this mean? This active rook? Well, on the right of the screen there's a list of the sorts of things that an active rook will be doing. Like the white rook in this position is quite active because it's attacking a weak pawn on c6, for example. So attack enemy pawns, support our own passed pawns, cut off the enemy king, and sometimes go after the enemy king, maybe in some sort of mating net. A passive rook, on the other hand, is a rook that isn't doing any of those things. Like the black rook here is already pretty passive, defending the pawn on c6. And Dvoretsky writes that if you've got a passive rook, you just need to do everything you can to change that situation and make that rook active, even if it means sacrificing a pawn, possibly two pawns, even if it means putting your king in a rubbish position. He rates the active rook sort of more highly than the active king. And that sounds like one of those general principles where you sort of then retrospectively pick a position to demonstrate that that's the rule. But of course, in chess, we know that there'll be plenty of other positions that sort of seem to go against that rule, which of course we all need to be on the lookout. But I've seen this endgame gone through before. It's a game from 1936, and Dvoretsky points out that it does illustrate very nicely how, in this case, black needs to activate their rook, play moves to do that, at the expense, in this case, of what's going to be a very poor king position, but still, drawing chances. In fact, the engine has this opening position as plus 0.4. So white's clearly got an advantage, but how to turn that advantage into a win. We've got weak pawns on a6 and c6. We've got an active rook. Black's got a passive rook. How do we go about winning it? And you could pause the video and think about what your first move would be in this position. You might think, for example, to go after the weak a pawn, or force the black rook back to a8 to defend it and then bring your king into the middle. Unfortunately, black's not going to wait, okay, because black's going to do exactly what we just talked about, that get your rook active, even if it means sacrificing a pawn. It's going to cost so much to try and hang on to that a pawn in terms of the activity of the rook. So black can just push the c pawn, bye a pawn, and this will give black excellent drawing chances. The engine's got that as dead even. So don't go after the a pawn straight away. You might instead think to play b4, just sort of clamping down on that c5 square, and also clamping down on the a5 square. So really fixing the black pawns on a6 and c6. The thing is your king's not really in the game yet, and this creates a weak spot that black can attack. It's a little bit premature to play b4. Black will centralise the king, which is what you should have done. Bit too late to centralise that king. Here it comes, and then rook b8. You've got to do something about your b pawn, like defend it, and then rook b5. And black's just got no problems here. Sure, we've got 3 pawn islands versus 2, but we've just shut out the white forces from getting to the a pawn, which is really black's main problem. We've got a nice central king now. White's not getting anywhere there, and again the engine's got that as dead even. So although this video is about active rook, we already have quite an active rook doing a good job here. Get your king into the middle, which is what happened in this 1936 game. King came into the middle, black did the same, king in the middle, king to d6. So black straight away put their king on a pretty good square. Now what would you do here? Have a think about it, pause the video, and decide what your next move should be as white. In rook endgames, tactics are always lurking. Not necessarily a tactic that's going to win the game on the spot or lose the game on the spot, but sometimes you can miss a tactic that's used to achieve a positional aim, and that's what happens here. You know, if white plays king d4, it's a big mistake. Okay, because black can play rook b8, threatening the same shutout with rook b5, and white thinks that's not a problem, you're not going to get it this time because I'll go rook a5, and black's like, tactics. That c-pawn can't be taken. Rook takes c5, rook b4 check, black wins, white's just dropped their rook. So we can't play king d4, because if we did, then after rook b8, the only move that stands any winning chances is to go after the a-pawn, but we can't do it because of c5, and we'd have to then just drop our king back. Black plays rook b6, and alright, 3-pawn islands, but black's got a nice control of the centre. Ooh, black's pawns turn into knights. Black's got nice control of the centre. White's rook's a bit offside. White's not making any progress there. So not king d4. Instead, in the game, white played rook a5. And now that a-pawn does need defending. Rook a8. This time king d4. And now c5 doesn't work. It just drops a pawn because we haven't got any kind of check chucking the d4 king off the protection of the c5 rook. Now black has to deal with the fact that white's coming through with e4. Dvoretsky calls it sort of widening the beachhead, and they're going to try and get their king over to the king side. So black plays f5, clamping down on the e4 square, which seems sensible, and then white plays that b4 move that we were talking about a minute ago. I mean, positionally, it's a good idea, you know, to clamp down on those two squares, sort of permanently fixing these two pawns as being weak. Before it was premature, now it's good. So it's sort of crunch time in terms of the moral of this video, the moral of this section in Dvoretsky about active rook, which sort of gives away what your plan should be, because you wouldn't know that if you're playing a game, would you? It's like, right, it's time to not care about my king position and play to activate my rook. In the game, black played rook b8, which is way too passive because white just plays a3, and then black's like, oh, I've got to move my rook back to a8. I mean, it would come to b6 maybe, but that might be even worse. It's just going to get stuck on b6 if you're not careful. And yeah, I mean, that rook's now guarding the a-pawn. White came through the middle, and we'll get back to that game in a sec, the way the game actually continued. But at this point, what you should do as black, and it just seems madness at first, because you've got this nice strong central king, you know, keeping the white king out. But this is more important. You've got to sort it out. Even though, you know, these moves are, even something like rook a7, staying passive, the engine still thinks it's quite equal in practical terms. A better plan for black is to never mind their king, bring it to this c7 square, come and defend the a6 pawn with your king, and then get that rook out, get it doing something aggressive. Ultimately, we're trying to get it down to black's second rank, and that's going to cause enough trouble to, you know, give black the counterplay that they need. So if black had played that, we'd have probably seen something like king c5, king b7, there's the plan. I mean, it just seems ridiculous, doesn't it? What an awful backward sort of submission from black to stick their king on b7. But he's actually doing a pretty good job. And now the black rook is free. King d6, the white king is in. Rook e8, and obviously that e-pawn needs defending. Rook a3. Now what would you do as black? We've got to get the rook down to the second rank. We need a plan to do it. What are some possible moves to get the rook down to the second rank? Well, some moves that suggest themselves, f4 is possible. This is pretty bad, and the main problem with it is that the f3 pawn is defended, which means, you know, with the black king offside on b7 and the white king already supporting a passed pawn march on the f-file, it's going to be very difficult for black to get their rook back to defend that. So white would just take rook e2, g4. This is coming through. And, there's just no way that black can sort of attack it from behind because of this blockade here on f3. So not f4. d4 is a bit double-edged, but still not great. White would just take that, rook down to e2. And there's a bit of sort of mutual pawn eating going on here. Rook c3, and then just both sides go after each other's pawns. But, even in that circumstance, even if white ends up with a better position here, it's still, you've activated your rook. I wouldn't want to play this position as either side, to be honest. Whereas the original position, I was pretty happy with white. This is exactly the sort of thing that, I wouldn't like. It's like, right, well, I'll take, black takes the G pawn, I'll take the C pawn. It looks better for white, but I was happier when it was all under control and black's rook was on a8 doing nothing. And I mean, it might not have been winning, but at least it was under control. This is a bit more knife-edged. Rook takes h2, we might see. A4, g5, now black's threatening. Rook h6 check, as well as pushing the g pawn. Like I said, it's a bit knife-edged. But white probably is better here still, Dvoretsky writes, after bringing the rook behind the g pawn. Okay, so I mean, double edge, but white's still doing very well there. So maybe not d4. A third possibility, and probably the strongest move out of the three that we're looking at here, although weirdly the engine thinks that king b6 is a good move, just bizarrely. G5. So we're going to get the rook down to the second rank by coming down with the g pawn. I mean, the point is that if white still just goes after the c pawn, then we can play f4. If that's taken, takes back, rook takes c6, rook d8 check, got to hold on to our rook, and then the d pawn gets pushed. Uh-oh, got to get back and stop that. d3, rook e1. This next move I like. Black's got, I mean, it's going to be like a +2 advantage for white unless black plays. I really like this move. I think it's an excellent move. Rook g8, how about that? This pawn's still a menace. We've got a rook taking the g pawn. Rook g1 doesn't defend it because black just plays d2 and then takes on g2. Yeah, really good move, and this is just going to be a draw again. The engine's got this as dead even. So that was rook c3 at this stage after that g5 move. White's better off stopping f4 with g3. And now if black plays d4, it's once again slightly better for white. E takes d4, rook down to the second rank, sure. But this time, because g5's been played, white's got rook a5, hitting across these two pawns. Black, I guess, would like to take on a2, but can't at the moment because the rook's defending it. And the g pawn and the f pawn are both undefended at the moment, so black will maybe defend the g pawn, but white's got a couple of winning lines here. I mean, the engine's got this as +2.6 now, and a4 is one way to do it. We might see these moves and white's winning, or even just taking on f5 straight away. I mean, these are just example variations, but again, white's just winning those positions. So that was after h6. Yeah, this is the line where black's played d4, isn't it? On this position here. So not d4. D4 leads to good positions for white, as we've seen, but instead g4 exclamation mark. Really, really yeah, clever move. And it's all about activating this rook. It's going to clear the e4 square, effectively. If white takes back, rook c3, rook f8. Black's got no problems there. This time that pawn on c6 can't be taken. So, yeah, black's just absolutely fine there. And if instead of taking it, white plays f4, then the rook's in. So this time if the c-pawn's attacked, rook c4. I mean, the engine's still got this as a very slight advantage for white, like plus 0.4. But, you know, compare this position and how this rook's much more active than this, you know, this original position or even a few moves later. In the game where we get to, you know, this position here, and in fact black plays rook b8, a3, and then rook back to a8. So I think I went through all the lines there actually that I intended to go through. For instead of playing rook b8 and then rook back to a8, black should just bring their king to the b7 square. Just defend the a6 pawn and the c6 pawn at the same time, and then get that rook out and start trying, you know, make a menace of it. Start trying to come and get these two pawns down here. Anyway, so yeah, black's now really passive with their rook. So white came through the middle, widening the beachhead. So now the king can head over and try and, you know, the principle of two weaknesses, come over here and try and do some damage. And black's next move is actually just fine in terms of it's not a losing move, rook a7, but they should still just go for the same plan. They should just bring their king back to c7. I mean, what does white try? King f4, would see rook f8 check, king g3, king to b6. White's got nothing. Dvoretsky's, you know, goes for a line that some grandmasters a while back analysed apparently. Rook e5, king goes to b6. White comes to collect the h-pawn, but black activates their rook this way, a5. Rook takes h7, this is just one example line, swap on b4. Come down and collect the b-pawn. White goes after the g-pawn, hoping for like a 2 on one side versus 1 on the other, which would usually be quite good. King f3, but black makes a menace of himself over here with rook h4. Obviously we can't swap the g-pawn for the h-pawn, otherwise there's no winning chances left. h3, and then rook h6, which seems to sort of go against the principle of what's going on here, because that's like a passive rook. But the passivity is just temporary, just a little, just to give you that extra move to get the c-pawn going. King g5, rook h8, and it's not just to get the c-pawn going. After we see this check, king b5, and then rook back to g7, trying to get behind the c-pawn. Black can actually push the c-pawn there, because rook c7 drops the g-pawn. And yeah, this would lead to a draw. I think we're going to be heading towards some sort of rook versus pawns or rook versus pawn, but obviously a drawn version. Investigate further, if you like. So not rook e5, and Dvoretsky does his thing about saying, oh, Grandmaster so-and-so and Grandmaster so-and-so analysed rook e5, but, you know, did they not see that? I think we should play h4. He does this thing where he sort of says that, you know, no one analysed this like me. Like, okay, yeah, well, you're obviously just a bit more marvellous than everyone else. So I'm still a massive fan of his book, but some of the stuff he writes it amuses me. And he reckons, yeah, just h4. I mean, to be fair, it is a good move. Just do not hurry. Just strengthen your position. Black brings the king to b6, g4. This is just an example. I mean, the engine's got this as completely drawn. And, you know, along these lines. I think Dvoretsky wrote back at this point that white has an indisputable advantage. And I'm looking at a number that shows that Stockfish disputes this indisputable advantage. But, hey. Yeah, I think it says an indisputable advantage, but very hard to see. But is it enough to see if it will go to a win or something like that? And Stockfish is just saying, No. I mean, I would rather be white, to be fair, but I'm struggling to see how white gets anywhere in that position. Anyway, so once again, black declined to activate their rook by making their king passive, and instead just sort of marked time with rook a7. White plays king f4, and then black thought, well, I can't have the king coming to the g5 square, because that would obviously be curtains. And indeed, if black plays rook a8, it is curtains. King g5, rook a7, king h6, king e6, g4. We're on +4 now, on the sort of the principle of two weaknesses. White's got control of the fifth rank. It's, black's just got too many weaknesses. The c pawn's still weak. It's very, very bad. But black doesn't have to play rook a8. I mean, obviously they can play h6 to stop the king coming into g5. But they can once again still do this. King c7, king g5, king b6, and they're still just about all right with the same idea. Rook's now free and can start doing something. Anyway, h6 played. h4, king e6, king comes to g4 to support the h5 pawn advance. There's no point black pushing either of those pawns. That's just going to create more weaknesses. So black just sort of guards, just marks time, just does nothing. Rook a8, h5, and here comes finally the actual losing move. It's still good for white, but once again, the principle of get your rook active was the way that black should have proceeded here and played rook g8. It just doesn't matter about the a pawn. I mean, it does. It's like engine saying +1, and that +1 is the a pawn that's about to drop. Takes, king back to h3, king over to d6, rook takes a6, and then black can just sort of stick their rook on g5 and sort of say to white, what have you got? I mean, that was also to stop this pawn's pinned, so that rook g5 stops b5, I suppose. White could set up b5 again, but then the king back to c7, and I mean, engine still prefers white, but there's good drawing chances. So although the whole time it was sort of objectively drawn, by carrying on being passive on a human versus human level, which is what this was, as it would be. This was 1936, so obviously an engine's not involved. But even today, we're looking to become better at human versus human chess. Well, certainly I am. I mean, it was the passivity of the rook which sort of just gave black all the trouble, and then finally the play with the black piece is cracked with g5. And now this is weak, I suppose the c6 pawn's still weak, and white just needs to do some manoeuvring, and they're in. White's next move was really very good. The f4 square is quite important to control, and white worked this out and played g3, so that's a really clever move. It's still winning if white just gets on with bringing their king back, now that we've got the weakness on h6. But black could then eventually, again, finally activate their rook. Rook down to f4. I mean, the engine's got that as good for white, but no better than the line we saw a minute ago with rook g8, and it's on +1. So the play with the white pieces, do not hurry. Saw that the f4 square is quite important. I mean, we're on +4 at the moment, and g3 maintains that +4. That was the move that was called for. Black just does nothing, because what else can he do? Rook a7, now the king comes back. Black does nothing, king comes into the middle. I think there was a bit of messing about here. Yeah. And then white plays rook e5. And now black's got to make a decision. Which way do they want their king cut off? The white rook's no longer hitting the a pawn, so the black rook is finally active, but it's too late. The white king's in. If they'd gone to f6, this is sort of quite a clever move, because you think, well, the king's gone that way, so the white king can go this way and just make its way to the b6 square. The problem is you've got a rook hanging on e5, but there's a clever little sort of finesse that white can play here, where they get their rook unhanging without loss of tempo. Is that a word? Unhanging? Can you unhang a rook? Anyway, attack the c pawn, black defends. Attack the a pawn, black defends. So you haven't lost any tempi, and this route's free. It's over. So black didn't choose king f6, or there wasn't really much they could do. King d6. White rook went back, so now the black king is cut off from the king side, and the plan's very easy, isn't it? The white king's just going to march into g6 and, you know, grab the h pawn, and this h5 pawn's going to queen long before black can do anything with this rook that's, I guess, finally active, finally in blue. I was trying to do a blue circle there. My colour schemes they do mean something, honestly. It's not just random colours. Rook e8, I suppose, allows the pawn ending, but it's trivially lost. I don't think there was much calculation going on there. Instead, black played c5, and there's nothing wrong with just taking on c5 here, but white played, Dvoretsky talks it, excellent endgame technique with rook d8 check. And the reason I think he's so enthusiastic about it is that the player with the white pieces had to calculate a particular king and pawn race. He had to calculate a pawn race, because the intention of rook d8 check is that, you know, I mean, we've got this pawns hitting each other thing going on here. So if the black king comes back and hits the white rook, you've got to move your rook, and then black takes on b4, and you would have been better off surely taking on c5 a second ago. But black had calculated, I'm going to swap the rooks if you do that. You know, I mean, if you just had this position on the board and just glanced at it, you think, hang on a minute, is that a one pawn race? You know, and it is. Just go through it. Whew, close one. But white had to calculate all of that 12 moves ago there. Yeah, so good stuff. Black then did also calculate that and decided to put their king on c6. Rook c8 check. I mean, they might as well have just gone for the pawn race, really. No, in fact, I'm not sure what they might as well have done. I think they were pretty stuffed. Rook takes c5, and I think black could have resigned this by now with a clear conscience, and finally does so there. So yeah, just to remind them, we started in this position, and it was all about black did eventually lose this because they didn't go for activating their rook, even at the expense of moving their king to a silly place, which was not there, it was there. That's after b4, sorry, this is where they should have gone for the king c7, king into c5, there's your king in a silly place, but there's the active rook, and after rook a3, different ideas, but it was this g5 move that was one of the main lines that illustrated it, I suppose. Right, next, this is a game from 1955. Materials equal. It is just objectively a completely drawn game. There's not actually much that either side can do here, but you would take black again because of the active rook, and black did win this game because white didn't make moves to get their rook active. So it's white to play, and a very, very simple way to draw this. I mean, both sides want to play this move. They both want to sort of improve their pawn structure with the h-pawn advance. because if it's ignored, the h-pawn goes on even further and creates a weak pawn. I mean, because if a black pawn gets to h4, the white pawn on h3 is weak. Similarly, if a white pawn gets to h5, the black pawn on h6 would be weak. So both sides want to do that, and black's ready to do that. White's not, because if white plays h4 here, then black's going to nab this f pawn. So what white should do to stop black doing it, and also not caring about this pawn, we should, even if it means sacrificing pawns to get our rook active, we should just do it. That, I guess it's that idea again. What white should do is play rook c6. So we're hitting the f pawn, so that if black plays h5 here, we just take on f6. And if black takes on a2, then our f pawn's no longer being hit. So now we can play h4. And all of a sudden white's just got, well, this is just a completely drawn position. Black's not going to be able to make any progress there at all. So that's what white should have done. By tying their rook down to the defense of the a pawn, they sort of gave themselves problems, which later led to a loss. Although there was nothing wrong with just sort of moving their rook back and forth on the second rank, and actually just cutting off the black king would have done it. To be honest, it's a very simple drawing plan, as we'll see. So rook h2 was played, and then black goes for it, h5. If this pawn is taken, that's very bad news. King takes h5, and black's threatening just to march the f pawn up. So if white tries to do something about that with h4, g4, white's dead. Okay, so we can't take on h5. If instead h4 is played, black takes on g4. Couple of choices here. This one's not very good. Black got lots of winning moves here actually, but 3 in fact. But f5 or king takes g5. The f3 pawn's still attacked, so defend it with rook f2. King takes g5. Those two could have happened the other way around. If instead king takes g4, f5 check, king back to g3, then g4. White's got to defend the f pawn again with rook f2, and then black can play king h5. Couple of lines we could look at here. King f4, rook a4 check. If the f5 pawn goes, g3, rook f1, and then rook takes on a2. Okay. Got to be careful not to snatch this and walk into a checkmate. So rook takes a2 was necessary there. And yeah, that's clearly just completely gone. So not king f4, but if white just sort of waits with rook f1, white's not doing anything. So black should just strengthen their position with a5. It's really interesting actually, because black plays a5. White goes, oh no, just waits around still, rook f2. By the way, actually, in after this a5 move, if white goes king f4, then this rook a4 doesn't work, because this white rook's ready to deliver that checkmate I just talked about straight away. So if the white king comes into f4, we'd have to see rook takes a2, king takes f5, and then g3. So we've transposed, but the move order was quite important. Anyway, white just waits around still with rook f2, and then we play rook a4. And as soon as the rooks come off the third rank, the pin's gone, and white can take on g4. Rook takes g4 check, king f3, and then king takes h4. What I found interesting was that, and it's, I really tried to explore it and couldn't really find a definitive reason for it, is that the engine evaluates this as -3, just completely gone for black, for white, sorry. So black's just winning this. And all because this a pawn's been pushed already. We can see that white could do, these sorts of moves. But if instead of playing a5 at this stage, black had gone rook a4, we see all the same lines, but the black pawn still being back on a7, and it wasn't as good. It was like instead of -3, it was -1, and I think it's to do with. It took me a long time to sort of be delving into it. I couldn't really find a definitive reason for it, but I think it was just in some variations, this pawn being further up the board. I think you would end up with rook and pawn versus rook. This one will be gone, and it's just that vital extra tempo. I think it was something to do with that, but whether I've got that right or not, the point is that white's doing nothing. In the endgame, do not hurry. Just strengthen the position with a5. And yeah, it does lead to a better position. Anyway, where were we? We'd got all the way to h5. Oh yeah, don't take on. That was it. We'd explored h4 and we explored. Yeah, this was really bad, and we just explored h4. So in the game, white played rook c2, and it's still just fine. Black played h4 check, king back to f2. Black then played a6, which Dvoretsky calls an incomprehensible move. Instead, they should have, got ready to centralize their king. But I think black was just sort of waiting. There's, I don't really see what black's got against the plan of putting our rook on e2 to stop the black king getting anywhere, and just sort of moving our king back and forth. I just don't see what black's got against that. So I think black was just sort of waiting for white to make a mistake, I suppose. But white didn't really make any obvious mistake, rook b2. Now Dvoretsky calls this a bad move, rook c3, because instead, before bringing the rook off the a file where it's hitting this pawn and allowing white to activate their rook, they should improve their positions the max. So get the a pawn forward as far as possible, get the king ready to come into the centre, then bring it off the a file. But the engine's not impressed with any of it, really. So yeah, rook c3, king back to g2, a5, and this is again called a bad move, rook f2, too passive. Engine still reckons it's completely drawn. But from a human versus human perspective, we should again activate the rook. Rook b7. It looks awful, doesn't it? Rook c2 check. King's forced to the back rank. A pawn's gone. We bring the rook behind the a pawn. And apparently loads of commentators going through this game at the time said it was just dreadful because white's allowed their pawn to get lost and their king's cut off on the back rank. But black's got nowhere to go. The black king can't get out either, so we can just move our rook, our king, sorry. We just shuffle our king on g1 and h1. If we get checked, come forward to g2 and h2. If the black pawn comes forward, we just check and then take on f5. And the black king just can't escape. We just leave our rook on a7. So, yeah, again, active rook. So this was a passive rook, but still fine as far as I can tell. And black then goes back to the a file. What black's waiting for, I think, here, was for white to come off the defence of f3, which they now do. Because if white doesn't come off the defence of f3, then, just put the rook on e2, king f7, just keep defending the f3 pawn. I don't see how black's getting out, and neither does the engineer. Wants to play king f8. I'll just put my king back on g2. I mean, Dvoretsky would want black to do this and then think about getting the black rook out. I suppose there's always a possibility of trying to get the pawn to a3 and engineer a rook onto b2 or something. You'd have to watch out for those sorts of things, I suppose. But there is a way for white to draw it, apparently, somewhere down the line. Anyway, so yeah, I think black was just sort of shuffling around, waiting for king f1, and then made their move for the centre with king f7. White then plays f4, which doesn't strike me as particularly clever. For me, this is where white's problems really begin. G takes f4, rook takes f4. It's still drawn. It's still objectively drawn. Black put their king back on g6. And then to really illustrate the passive rook thing, white played rook f2 and resigned at the same time. Because they've realised this is just completely gone. Rook f2, I mean, I think the a6 move earlier on that Dvoretsky calls incomprehensible. I think I can comprehend it. I think black was just saying, right, you have a go, because I'm not quite sure what's going on here. And maybe they were trying to shuffle around and get their king out somehow across the e-file. But with the active rook, again, it's active rook. Theme of this video, white could have still drawn this quite happily. Just let the a pawn go. And it's not about coming after the h4 pawn. If you go after the h4 pawn, you're still alright there just, but not -1 it reckons. Now you're lost. This is just lost. Lost. There you go. Rook b1 check and a1 equals queen is about to happen. So it's not about going after the h pawn. The point of this rook f5 idea is a Vancouver like setup again. We would rather than rook h5, white should just play king g1. And black's got nothing. We just keep hitting the pawn laterally. Okay. The black king can't cross the f file because of this pawn push. I'm going to liquidate even more, and that's completely going to be it's going to be the Vancouver almost, isn't it? With just these extra pawns on the board. If the h pawn's attacked, we come forwards to h2. Is that important? I presume we don't want to allow rook g3 check. Let's have a look. It looks like it is important actually, because white's got 3 drawing moves, which are king h2, king f4. So you can put your king on these 2 squares, but that does look like it loses. King g2. King g2 looks like it loses. But king h2, what's wrong with that? King g7. Yeah, even if black can sort of engineer a zugzwang where we have no moves now, we're attacking the a pawn laterally, and we're getting ready for that pin that I talked about. So the rook now has to move off f4 because we can't come to g2. I mean, I presume it's rook g3 check. That's the loot. Yeah, there you go. So rook g3 check just wins. So yeah, don't want to pick king on g2. So we are in zugzwang. We have to come off the f file because we've got to keep hitting that a4 pawn laterally. We've just seen that if black can extract their rook, then we've got the rook to the side of the pawn, which we know is going to be slightly better for them. King f7, rook back to e4. Black could still go for a zugzwang again, trying to get us off the e file, which I think is forced. But even if they get their king to e7, they've got to get their king all the way to the defense of the a pawn, and there's just no shelter from the checks from the side. It's a draw. So that's what white should have done. All about active rook. I got a bit confused going through this one actually in the book. What the sort of the final conclusion was. It didn't come across like white had lost it because of a critical move that they did at any particular time. It was just they ended up in trouble because they never went active with their rook, even at the last minutes. It was just sort of a collection of here this move was better than this one, although objectively the worst move was still a draw, and then that led to another position where here this move was better than this one, although objectively the worst move still led to a draw, and then finally the worst move didn't objectively lead to a draw, it lost. And I guess the idea is that at any given stage, like even right at the start, if white just goes active straight away with their rook, just drops the a pawn and doesn't care about it, it's just easy to draw straight away. I guess that was the idea. Right, this one is black to play. You could pause the video and decide what should black play here. This is sort of similar to the last one in that same way that white's going to improve their position with like e4 check, king to g4, f3, rook b5, a4. This can sort of come forward, come down the board at black. And none of it actually gets anywhere. But to avoid problems that white sort of improve their position, black should again think about active rook. And they can just draw this straight away with rook d3. Just stop white playing e4. B pawn's gone, sure. Rook a3, rook to b2, rook a4, and the players actually agree to draw there. It is also amusing in the Dvoretsky book as well, because this was the player with the black pieces. He was one of his students in the 1970s, and he ended up winning the World Junior Championship, which Dvoretsky says is sort of at the end of their collaboration together. In other words, it was down to him a little bit, he reckons. And he said, yeah, so for him, he said all my students knew about active rook, so this was just a simple technical device for him. It's like, are you sure? Are you sure that you sure he didn't think long and hard in this position, and then work out that was the best thing to do with all your coaching on active rook in there somewhere, maybe, I don't know. He's just like, oh yeah, all my students they just knew exactly what to do all the time because of me. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh. I mean, I'm still his, #1 fan right now going through this book, but yeah, it's funny some of the things he's written. In this position, by the way, rather than taking the pawn, white might try a4. Black just comes behind it. King f3. Here's a nice little sequence that black can do. g4 check. And if that pawn's snatched, b5. How about that? And the a pawn's getting swapped. White's got to be careful actually not to lose that if they start leaving a black pawn on a4. So yeah, takes. Rook b3. Draw. And finally, oh yeah, this one's quite good. I quite like this one. So yeah, pause the video. It is black to play. What should black play here? So we'll go with the game continuation first of all to show the problems, or the problem that black's got here. I mean, the white rook is sort of, is that passive? Not completely. It's only one move away from going after this, but the black rook's quite active as well. So black wants to meet rook c4 with rook b3, attacking the a3 pawn. So when the a4 pawn goes, the g3 pawn goes. And given that, the game continuation is really quite poor, to be honest. King g7, and white plays rook c4. Now at this point, black did realise, oh, I can't play rook b3, and then that's it, passive rook. We've just gone from a drawn position to +3, and white went on to win fairly comfortably. King c3, and we can show the game moves. But I mean, is there that much to show? It carried on like this, but I'm not sure why black carried on in this position here, but they did. Took a long time to resign this one. There you go, finally resigned there. And it became a lost position as soon as they played King g7 and white played rook c4, and then they realised, oh, I can't play rook b3. And why can't they play rook b3? Well, because the g pawn can't be taken because of this. So back in the original position, black had to deal with that. Now, King f7 does lead to a draw, but it's not simple, and I'm not going to go into them. You can explore it for yourselves if you wanted to. There's a lot of different variations in there where it's not clear, because white's main problem is that they're defending these pawns at the moment. They're on the same rank, and white wants to play g4 So king f7 can be met by g4. And it's still a draw, but it gets complicated. And the easiest way to draw this by a country mile is to play h5. Because now g4 would just lead to, well, let's just see it. g4 is one of the moves. Black can then play h4. And that fixes this pawn on h3 as a permanent weakness. I mean, you can also swap on g4. It also leads to a draw, but this is the simpler way to do it, to h3 being a permanent weakness. If white goes for rook c4, then the g4 square is covered. Draw. The white king's cut off. I mean, the h pawn is attacked straight away. We might see h4, and yeah, the black rook can just come behind the h pawn. And finally, after this h5, if white tries h4, we can go rook g7. The rook's coming to g4, where it defends the a pawn and attacks the g3 pawn, and the white king can't get past the fourth rank without the help of its rook, which would then drop the g3 pawn. There you go. Right, I think that's it on active rook. They were all the positions I was going to go through. Well, that's gone over 50 minutes now, so let's hope we said something useful in the middle of all of that.